Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the Cross and the Olive Tree Palestinian Christian Voices Today, sponsored by the ICJS, the Institute for Islamic Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, Maryland. As some of you know, I'm Ben Sachs, the Director of Scholarship and the Jewish Scholar for the ICJS. ICJS is an independent educational interreligious nonprofit founded in 1987, and we've worked for nearly 4 decades to build an interreligious society in which dialogue replaces division, friendship overcomes fear, and education eradicates ignorance. We do this by creating communities of learning in the greater Baltimore area. Through our public-facing scholarship and relationship-focused educational programs, we create interreligious learning opportunities where people who believe differently can connect with one another. So for more information about ICJS, please visit our website, icjs.org. So I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers, the authors or the author editors, but also contributing authors to The Cross and the Olive Tree, Cultivating Palestinian Theology Amid Gaza. Um, I want to first introduce John Munayer. He is a Palestinian theologian from Jerusalem and holds degrees from King's College London, the University of Edinburgh, and VU Amsterdam. John is currently involved in interreligious activism and is a founder and editor of the Journal of Palestinian Christianity at the Bethlehem Bible College. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, researching the political theology of the Palestinian laity in relation to the Holy Fire ceremony. Sam Munayer is a Palestinian theologian from Jerusalem and holds degrees from Durham University and Exeter University. Sam works as an advocacy and access officer for a humanitarian organization that works in Gaza and the West Bank. And for those that are curious, John and Sam are brothers. Um, and if you can tell by the slanted roofs, they may actually live together too. Um, but it is a pleasure to welcome you both to this conversation and to talk about your book. Also, you'll notice in the chat we provided a link to the book for those that are interested to purchase through Orbis. Um, so I'm going to start our interview with a question for both. Um, in your introduction, you very poignantly talk about olives and olive oil and its relationship to Palestinian identity. And you say that picking olives connects you to God, your family, and to your roots as, quote, serving as a metaphor for how Palestinian theology ought to connect us to God, to one another, our tradition, and our land. Would each of you just explain why olives and olive oil in particular are so important to your theology?
Yes, thank you so much, Ben and ICJS. Really appreciate platforming us and also the good work that you're doing in the US. With regards to your question, when me and Sam were writing the introduction to the book, it was during the olive harvest season in Palestine. And we remember as kids picking the olives in the land that was taken away from my grandparents. And one time we were picking the olives, and our grandfather came to join us from the land that was taken. So it was supposedly not something we were supposed to do. And he started telling us the story of how he lost the land and how him and our family were forced by Israeli soldiers out of their home, and that they fled in the church of St. George in the city of Elid, or also known as Lydda or Lod in Hebrew and in Greek. And this sort of story connected our family to the land and to the church in Palestine. So these three things were interpreting one another. We can't understand one without the other, and that's why we decided to use, amongst a few other reasons, the olive tree as a metaphor for Palestinian theology, and eventually also olive oil for Palestinian theology as well. So I'll let Sam expand on that.
Just to mention, if you want to understand which one is the younger brother, you can tell by our hairlines. So we live together, and I'm the younger brother with a slightly better hairline than John, but maybe in a few years' time I'll be in the same situation. Uh, so as John mentioned, we encountered our faith and our own personal journey through in the olive groves with our grandparents. So describing Palestinian theology through an encounter, I think is an essential for any form of reflection, any form of theological interpretation. It's done through an encounter. Uh, and therefore we decided to start there. But I think more broadly speaking, for Palestinians, olive trees are a very strong symbol of identity. Olive oil is an essential part of Palestinian cultural and daily life. Whether it's olive oil for consumption, for illumination, for using it for lamps, or whether it's through soap, olive oil is a really important element within the Palestinian landscape and life. And therefore, when we do theology, we do that within our own identities and we describe Palestinian theology in our own terms through the symbols and the land itself, which is a part of our daily lives. So, this is not unique what John and I are doing. Palestinians have been relating to olive trees, olive oil, for many, many years and in different ways. They Palestinians see their own identities through the olive trees, which is more of a symbol of land, and we're really doing theology within the land of Palestine, and therefore, uh, beyond just our encounter with our own identities with our grandparents, as John described, it is fitting for the general notion and relationship between land, faith, and politics that Palestinians hold towards trees, God, and the reality in Palestine and Israel.
Yeah, thank you. I was also struck by the image of God's light also being illuminated through olive oil, which is something I think a number of our traditions can really connect to in beautiful ways. Um, so your book includes, I think there are 8 authors, including the two of you. Um, and I was wondering if you could explain not all of the essays, but a common thread among the essays. I discerned sort of a narrative theology that these are people who are living their theology in less abstract ways, and that part of the compelling part of their stories is how it connects to something deeper and ineffable. So I was wondering if you could walk us through the contributions and how you see it playing out to a broader Palestinian theology.
Absolutely. This book might be different than other Palestinian theological books in a number of ways. And just to give a bit of a backstory, when me and Sam were going to write a completely different project, and then the October 7th attack and the beginning of the genocide in Gaza started, we felt like we had to theologically wrestle with these questions. And that's when we invited other people because we thought we needed to do this as a collective, as a community, and not just 2 people alone. And that's sort of how the project came to be. And there's 3 really common threads throughout the articles, which distinguish it, I think, slightly from some other Palestinian theological work. The first one is that we're not trying to combat explicitly Christian Zionism within the book. A lot of Palestinian theology oftentimes focuses on trying to get Christians in the West not to be Zionist. This is not what the book is trying to do. This book is trying to answer questions that inside our communities we are asking, whether that be those who are living in Palestine, Israel, or those abroad who want to see justice and peace in this land. So this book is more of an internal look as opposed to an advocacy type of theological book that a lot of our colleagues oftentimes work on. The second thing is that it's a book that is trying to make connections with other movements of struggle, of liberation, or other struggles who have experienced great injustices, such as the African American experience. So there's a chapter in the book that brings together in conversation Palestinian theology and Black theology in the US. There's another chapter that engages with indigenous theology in North America. What can we learn from these communities? And there's another chapter that engages with the genocide in Guatemala. What can we learn from these different contexts? As at times, a lot of the powers or forces that are inflicting pain and injustices in one part of the world oftentimes are connected to others. And the last and third, I think, really important sort of element within the book that is different is that when we're looking for theological sources, we are trying to look in many different areas. So usually when you write theology, at least Christian theology, you look at, scripture, church fathers, the tradition, or other theological books, and these are very valuable and important. This book is looking also at our grandmothers as theology. So the first chapter actually is written by our amazing colleague and friend Youssef Khouri, who's from Gaza, and his family at the moment are sheltering in Gaza. And he writes about how his grandmothers shaped the way he relates to God and also to his neighbor. So he speaks about one of his grandmothers that an Israeli soldier barges into their home. And instead of yelling at the soldier or wanting to kick him out, she makes a loaf of bread for him and gives it to him. And he says that that moment helped develop his sort of theology of love of neighbor far more than a lot of other sources. Or we look at other elements within our tradition and our cultures. So it's these three things, I think, that kind of distinguish the book.
I'll very briefly add, Ben, that what connects these chapters is geography. Each contributor is speaking from a particular space within Palestine, whether it be Gaza, Jerusalem, Nazareth, Hebron, Bethlehem. And really, the intention with all the contributors and what really is a common thread is the locality of where we are doing theology, which informs us not only in our spiritual reflection, but our day-to-day lives. Whether it's our work in interreligious spaces, in educational spaces, and more and much more. So I think that really connects, it grounds you to the land. It goes back to the olives. It goes back to grounding ourselves within the space that we are present in, and to make sure that our theology is accessible. And I think all of the chapters, although they are not, uh, I think all of the chapters have a very strong degree of academic foundation. I think all of them are also extremely accessible for the common reader who's interested in what Palestinian Christians think. And these are all contributors that are for men and for women, so very much we're highlighting the female role or the feminist uh, tones within Palestinian theology that is often overlooked. I think the future of Palestinian theology is the contributors in the book, which half of them are female, and there's many more, and also young theologians. So we're representing in some ways a new wave within Palestinian theology that began its reflection in the events of the Nakba in 1948, and we are continuing that reflection in the genocide of Gaza. So the locality of the book within our present geographies, but overall within the tradition of Palestinian theology, I think is what really connects all the authors, in addition to what John explained earlier.
Thank you. Yeah, for those who haven't read it, you could read it pretty quickly. It's a very accessible book and poignant. And for the academics, there are a lot of footnotes and a lot of references, so you can get both, which is unique for a type of work like this. And so I just want to reiterate our gratitude for it. Um, I want to stay with the interreligious part, if it's okay. Um, so, one of the interesting things about the authors, and yourselves included, is that you write about your experiences as Christians as a minority in a Jewish Israeli context, a minority in a Palestinian Muslim context. Interreligious dialogue in North America and in Europe operates from a sense of a Christian hegemony, right? That it's a Christian culture. Um, there's a certain dynamic that takes place, even like a power relationship between parties in interreligious contexts. You're coming from a place that most Christians that we work with don't come from, and it's a place of minority status, and there's a liberation theology that's related to your minority status as Christians. Would you mind just speaking about that a little bit and how you see interreligious dialogue from your perspective as Palestinian Christians? Should I make Sam go first since he made that comment about your hair, which also hit me to
I'll
the
go
core?
first. I'll go first. As the older brother with receding hairline. Um, yeah, I think many people involved in interreligious dialogue oftentimes think that there's one type of interreligious dialogue among many other challenges and I think issues and limitations within the field of interreligious dialogue. And oftentimes the Western dynamics get placed on other contexts, such as our own here. So, as you mentioned, you in the US operate in a context where Christianity is the hegemon power. You know, it's everywhere in the US, and it's the Jews and the Muslims, at least, who are the minorities who tend to not have as much power, tend to be more threatened in terms of their identity. And threat of sort of ignoring who they are. But in our context, that is not the case. We Christians here were less than 2% of the population. So when people engage with our theology, they're oftentimes thinking of us as the ones who have the power, when it's not the case. There's actually going to be a report that comes out on March 17th, where it documents all the cases of harassment and attacks against Christians, mostly in Jerusalem, but in other areas in the country, by different groups of usually young Orthodox Jews, right, who tend to spit at Christian clergy or vandalize different churches or write graffiti on the walls of churches, right? So this is a very different type of context where in the West it's usually the Christians who are the ones who are in power and tend to be the ones persecuting the religious minorities. So I think this is something that's really important, and it's also something that really I think makes Palestinian theology unique is that it's sort of interreligious in essence, because as a Christian minority, you cannot ignore your Muslim or Jewish neighbors and siblings. You have to engage with them. In some ways, engaging with them is a way for you to protect yourself or to survive in and of itself. So I think that's something that's really important for when thinking about interreligious dialogue in general, but Jewish-Christian relations specifically.
I let John go first because his work is more related to interreligious spaces. I will add that going back to the olive trees, if our theology is to be contextual and relevant, then it has to address the neighbor, it has to address the enemy, it has to address all identities and people groups within the land in which we are living in. So to not engage with Muslims and Jews, I think would make our theology less contextual and perhaps more Western and more like your context rather than our own. Secondly, is that really Palestinian Christian identity and Palestinian Muslim identity and Jewish identity in Israel is formed over centuries in our histories and our traditions is interwoven with one another. When you walk in the old cities of Jerusalem, you see that the churches that we have, the buildings that we have, the landscape of Palestine is built in relationship to one another. So our identity is very much interconnected with other people. And therefore, as John mentioned, perhaps the Western model of interreligious dialogue is less familiar as interreligious living in Palestine. We live together, we pick olives together. And therefore, interreligious living is much more of a suitable framework, I think, that all of the contributors and ourselves are familiar with. And that is a part of our indigenous heritage. When you go to the various holy sites and traditions that we have as Palestinian Christians, there is always a sort of transcendental, sectarian, sorry, practice that occurs between specifically Christians and Muslims, but also Jews. And we see that that erasure happened in 1948, the beginning of where the erasure of this kind of interreligious practice and living started to be assaulted. So therefore, when we're speaking about this, we're speaking not as a place where we bring the priest and the imam and the rabbi together on a stage to speak, but we're speaking as people who are living in the same building, who pray together and who eat together. You know, now is the season of Ramadan and Lent. We're fasting together. So, this is very much the fabric in which we are doing our theology in.
Thank you. Yeah. I was struck by both of you talking about as your identity as being explicitly interreligious, and that a Christian theology that is explicitly interreligious is something that thinkers in North America and Europe have thought about, but not from the position of everyday life as also a form of survival. I really appreciate that comment, at least to think about a little bit further. I want to move to one of the essays. Um, so, as you may or may not know, Baltimore is a primarily African American city. And so the essay that by Esmira Hamrouri Davis, A New World is Coming, She is on Her Way. Um, it spoke to me as a Baltimorean in that there are certain experiences there that may not be my own, but there's certainly experiences that play a role in my everyday life. And she talks about it in the legacy of African American and Palestinian transnational solidarity. And she does it through this really interesting engagement with womanist theology. Um, and so I'm wondering how this connection, and you don't have to focus on the womanist theology, since I know that Sam, you're not a theologian, but the connections between the Palestinian and African American experience that people are starting to theorize a little more. I mean, I know that they've been doing it since the 1970s, but that it's becoming more of a explicit partnership. What are some of the things that this relationship can teach others about solidarity and engagement? This relationship between African Americans and Palestinians.
First, I want to push back against the term who is and who is not a theologian, because in the book we actually speak about that. We do
See,
not,
wonderful. So you caught me.
yeah,
I
we
did read the
don't.
book, but I was following the conversation. My apologies.
I make the same mistake we all do, you know, but we need to remember the phrase, at least from one of our saints, that a theologian is one who prays, and someone who prays is a theologian. So
Mm.
anybody who is doing God talk, at least from our perspective, is doing theology, which is literally the definition. But in the God talk of Asmera and the relationship that is so important to highlight and connecting the different struggles for liberation and oppression, that occurs transnationally are so important to highlight for a few reasons. So the first is that the experience of exile that the African slaves and that the African American experience has is very much connected to the experience of exile of Palestinians. The same kind of rupture that has happened to the Palestinian identity by being exiled from the land is very much holds deep connections to the same kind of experience that African American slaves hold held and the current Black experience of North America holds. So that's the first point, is that there's a deep sense of connection there, of experience. And that is why figures like James Baldwin and Malcolm X recognized the Palestinian reality as one that is also under white supremacy. Um, and they made that connection because of that common experience of exile. And that also connects to theology. So Black theology, the womanist theology that Azmera is drawing on, and the Black theology of James Cone is one that uh, frequently referenced Palestine as a place of connection and connection to how not only of experience but also how it interprets the Bible, the gospel as a proclamation of good news for oppressed peoples. And in that connection, it illuminates, it unveils that the system of oppression that occurs in the world is one that is transnational. So the systems that govern, that oppress people around the world are transnational. So let me give you a quick example of this kind of material feeling and connection that we have. So in order to fund the capitalist empire of the United Kingdom, of the British Empire, and later the American Empire, was through the labor of tobacco, sugar, and cotton. And the profit of the slaves, of the commodities of people's bodies through the slavery of cotton and sugar and tobacco made the Western Empire, the modern Western Empire, very rich and enabled the support of systems and structures that are oppressing Palestinians. So, in other words, the system in which allowed the commodification of black bodies is the same system that is funding the current reality that is oppressing Palestinian people. And I think that's where Asmer is really hinting at, is that both of her identities as an African American and as a Palestinian coincide, and that even though those traditions hold common threads, they also have different lessons and different insights that we can both benefit from one another. And we know that the black churches, for example, in North America, sometimes can be quite racist towards Palestinians, and we know that Palestinians can sometimes be racist to black people. So I really think that is what it's at the heart of where Esmera is trying to steer us in her chapter.
And I'll just quickly add that what Azmer and some of the other contributors are trying to do by connecting to these other contexts is also realizing that if we want to improve and liberate ourselves and deal with these issues of injustice, we have to do it together. And actually combining our efforts, we will be much more successful. And this is true for other struggles, whether that be against people who are extremely Islamophobic and anti-Muslim, or even speaking to you, Ben, as someone who may have experienced anti-Semitism. That these same forces oftentimes are the ones who are pressing all of us or demonizing all of us at the same time, and therefore we have to build broad coalitions. And this is something that uh, James Cone tried to do a lot in his theology and has influenced us too.
No, I think what speaking about my own experience, what I think I find both frustrating and compelling is that like you cannot imagine Jewish history, life, and thought without exile. And that exile sort of informs my everyday theological and cultural experience. And that there's something about exile in the way that it's not simply just othering, but there's the dehumanizing element of feeling exile that creates a variety of responses. It could just be that the grandmother baking bread, or it can be redemptive violence. It could be loving and being in solidarity with people who are also oppressed. Or Sam, you were saying being racist or prejudiced towards one another. But there's something so fundamentally inhuman about the process of exile that informs my own God talk. Um, you're making me think maybe I am a theologian, but we'll save that for another day. So I want to move now into the embodied and physical aspects of the theology that you write explicitly about in the book, which is a Palestinian theology of martyrdom. Um, would each of you just tell us what a Palestinian theology of martyrdom is, and then how that informs the way that you approach your work and life?
Absolutely. So this was a very difficult chapter for me and Sam to write, theology of martyrdom, and even after writing it, me and Sam often reflect and question what we wrote, because it's a very heavy topic that we don't necessarily always feel qualified to talk about, especially as the fact that me and Sam live in Jerusalem. We don't live in Gaza and have not experienced what the people there have experienced. But generally speaking, when October 7th and then the genocide started, I was teaching at the Bethlehem Bible College, and I had prepared sort of a lecture for the students in the month of, I think it was November or December, I can't remember. And the students were like, "John, we don't want to talk about what you prepared. We want to talk about whether we should stay or leave." Because they understood that if they leave Bethlehem, they might guarantee a slightly safer life. But if they stay, which I think many of them want to do, it will require a very, very difficult path. And at the same time, Sam and me and my family, there were two threats against our family members by a very right-wing fascist Israeli organization. And this was sort of a few days after the war started. And we had to ask very difficult questions. What do we do? How do we respond to this? And these questions of martyrdom came up. So this is why we decided to address it. And as we know, also, there's been, during the genocide in Gaza, there's been many Christians who have been killed, whether it be by the bombing of the churches or Israeli snipers killing elderly women in the church complex as well. So this question of martyrdom was constantly on our minds and still is, since the genocide has not finished. So this is kind of why we try to engage with it, and really we wanted to orientate any Palestinian theology around martyrdom, because sometimes we find a lot of Christian institutions or organizations or leaders here in Palestine, Israel, who tend to fundraise on this idea that Christians are such a small population and they're decreasing. And therefore you have to sort of, maintain the Christian presence in the land by donating, which is important. But that shouldn't be our guideline as Christians, at least speaking, because we should be witnesses to the gospel regardless of the consequences, and we do not determine our success or failure by the numbers that we have in our churches, but rather by the witness that we are showcasing to the people around us. And therefore, we decided to tackle that specific question.
Just reflecting on your point, Ben, of exile, because as John mentioned, when we received those death threats for our family members by this group, I thought about my grandparents who hid in the Church of St. George during the Nakba. So whenever there's experience of exile, the memory is so important, right? Memory within that context of oppression. Just wanted to flag that because it really informed our chapter about martyrdom. And as John mentioned, death is a martyrdom, and death is a very uh, misconceived term. It is a term that is loaded with different emotions and different understandings of what that is. And John and I wanted to talk about that and address the death that there is there, the questions that we have, that we all have. What is the purpose of what we're living for when there is a context of great cost? What is the role of our lives and our deaths within our spiritual being? And what we argue in the chapter that martyrdom is not so obsessed about from our Christian understanding, of course, that martyrdom is not so much focused on the death part, it's more focused on the life. It's more focused on the witness to love, the witness to principles of justice and truth, even when it comes at a great cost. And that's why we like to quote one of the Latin American liberation theologians cited in that chapter, is that liberation in politics may make our faith relevant, but martyrdom is really what makes it credible. And martyrdom can be in different forms of paying a big price for what you believe in, and that witness that you give. And that's the literal definition in Greek, in the New Testament Greek, and also in Arabic, is martyrdom means witness. And as John mentioned, martyrdom and the theology of martyrdom does not give you this sense of fatalism or where what we call the theology of survival that is so focused on the survival of oneself and therefore compromises its witness. But the theology of martyrdom really focuses on agency, focuses on community, you know. In the Christian tradition, uh, you begin your journey of martyrdom in baptism, and in baptism you cannot baptize yourself. You need to ask someone else to baptize you. As even Jesus asked John the Baptist to baptize, God. So there's an element of agency and there's an element of community of witnessing to one another that is so important as we are trying to wrestle with these questions of witness and death and suffering and costly love that we are trying to attempt to do in our land to both our neighbors and our enemies and ourselves. So that is kind of at the heart of that theology of martyrdom. And I think so much conversation and so much talk is so abstract to the suffering of the innocent, is abstract to the suffering of people's own mental torment, is abstract to our own daily lives, full of suffering, that a theology of martyrdom, rather than ignoring it, is speaking directly to it. And that's a conversation that John and I want to have this exactly because of the genocide in Gaza and exactly because the term martyrdom is abused so much, but holds also a lot of power. So that's in short why it motivated us to speak about this theology.
Thank you. I have one final question for both of you. As you were both reflecting, there is something remarkable about what the high as you were describing hiding in churches, right? And I think about my own family's history and how I came to the US, which is a common story. My family was hiding. Um, and it was unimaginable violence, and they made their way here. And so there are these elements of human experience that catalyze in like both beautiful and horrible ways. Um, and we even see some of this in the US today with the weaponization of our immigration informant uh, patrols and the sort of violence in our cities. And there's something about putting people in hiding that creates that sort of dehumanization that requires a certain theology to liberate oneself. But your your brother wrote a chapter on liberation and reconciliation. Um, and I was just curious how both of you think about this tension between liberation and reconciliation, because ultimately we all have to live together. But liberation is something that's required for certain equity and inclusion in all societies. But how is reconciliation even possible when liberation is required, right? So how are they not in tension? How do you see these two things working together?
Yeah, and I think that chapter, Daniel's chapter, is so important for organizations and initiatives and institutes like ICJS because oftentimes we are either focusing too much on the reconciliation side of things and the restoring personal relationships and forget the systems and the realities around us, or we are focusing too much on the struggle to dismantle these structures and systems, but forget about the overall redemptive vision of humanity. And that is what we believe as, loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, the way Daniel enters the conversation, I think, is in a very important way because they shouldn't be excluded, liberation and reconciliation. And why is that? Because we understand theologically that sin is one that distorts relationships. When Adam and Eve sin, they they ruin the relationship not only with one another, but also with the divine, with God. And we see this throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, in order to atone for your sins, the outcome of it is a restorative process, a restorative relationship with God and ultimately with your neighbor. And that is the process of reconciling oneself to God, reconciling that place of sin to redemption. Now, liberation theology and what Daniel speaks about, it understands that sin is not only between myself and yourself, Ben. I lie against you, I am mean to you, but understands sin in systems. And this is where a lot of peace initiatives and dialogue initiatives miss the point, is that systems distort relationships. The patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism destroys the relationships between people. And therefore, to restore that kind of dynamic where people can get along with one another and ultimately with the divine and really restore it into a healthy and intended uh, reality, you have to dismantle those systems. And if those systems are a form of sinfulness, then we ought to reject and rebel against those systems of sin. That's the liberation part. And that liberation and reconciliation part provides you actually the same goal is to restore the cosmos and ultimately relations between people. And I think where Daniel looks at his examples is very relevant from the Bible, are very relevant examples to the Northern American context and to the Palestinian context. He looks at Exodus, when the Hebrew slaves uh, were fighting against Pharaoh, the Egyptian midwives were assisting them. He looks at the disciples of that Christ called, such as Matthew the tax collector, an oppressor who collaborated with the Roman Empire, and Simon the Zealot, who was a freedom fighter. And in this um, in these co-resistance framework that Daniel looks at as examples, it envisions and it imagines a way that we can also coexist together, oppressed and oppressor people, people with different realities, people with different identities. And I think that is the model and the helpful and fruitful way in which we should engage liberation and reconciliation together. They're not separate, they're interlinked, and we should see them as so. Uh, and ultimately, what Daniel also warns is that if you envision a path of liberation without a redemptive vision of reconciliation, you might become the oppressor that you fought against. So the Palestinians might become, once achieved liberation, they might become also oppressors. And I think that's the real important element that Daniel is trying to point at is that liberation and reconciliation should point us towards the reality of redemption, where relationships are restored.
And I think Daniel's chapter is so practical and important because it also highlights how we can be oppressors in some systems and oppressed in others. And me and Sam, for instance, as men here, can easily participate in Palestinian culture and in systems and cultures that oppress women. But at the same time, being Palestinian, we're also oppressed, right? So I think it also helps us holding that nuance and complexity of understanding that we can be both the ones doing harm and receiving harm. And I think it's really, really important, especially when we're engaging in different contexts, such as perhaps North America and Palestine, Israel. And if I can take it and be more explicit, as Palestinians, especially as Palestinian liberation theologians, we oftentimes get accused of just focusing on the liberation and that's simply part of it. We need to be liberated, but the goal is not for us then to be the one who are privileged and oppressors towards our Jewish neighbors. No, that is not what we're trying to do. We're trying to completely restore and change the dynamics of our relationships so we can all live in equality, justice, and peace. And I think, unfortunately, in many interreligious spaces, people have looked at Zionism as this sort of liberation movement from true anti-Semitism. And I think one could say that Zionism, in many ways, is a liberation movement gone wrong, where maybe some of its intentions are one of security for Jews in Europe and in the West, but then eventually it comes on the expense of Palestinians, this sort of project. So how can we reimagine and challenge the ways we've previously engaged with these topics and think about ways of how we, Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Muslims, and Christians can really dismantle these systems that are oppressive, but also do it in a way that completely restores our relationships so that we're all equal and living in proper relationships as God has intended.
I can't thank both of you enough. This has been a really important, informative hour. Thank you for your insights and for leaving us with that image of being both oppressed and oppressor. I'd also add both of you know Hebrew. Hagar and Hagar are literally the same word. Hagar being the Egyptian woman that's banished, but then gets to see God or name God and names God El Roi, the God who sees me. And the ger is the stranger, so that the ger can be the oppressor and the oppressed simultaneously, depending on the context. I think that's a really powerful way to end with that image of reconciliation and liberation. The first question we received, I'll just read it. I am so grateful for the incorporation of feminist theology, but I'm also curious about queer and trans theology and how that might be incorporated into this framework. Here, queer theology is really marginalized and sidelined, so I'm curious if the same is true in the Palestinian context.
Yeah, that's definitely another strand of liberation theology, or even a critique of liberation theology, when you look at scholars like Marcella Reed or indecent theology, which offers a powerful critique to liberation theology and further enriches the intersectional approach, which I would say is something that we need to study much more. And one of the contributors of the book, Marah Sarji, who writes the chapter about Guatemala, is actually doing her PhD precisely on combining or getting inspired from the works of Marcella Reed and indecent theology with other Palestinian forms of liberation theology. So I think really the person who's kind of leading us in this conversation and breaking certain barriers that we need in our own community to enter and to enter into conversation is Marah. Marah is really leading this conversation, and I think it will further enrich what the overall spirit of the book is, which is involving different perspectives, having internal critiques as well. And I think that is definitely a theology that needs to be engaged more and offers also a very important critique to liberation theology. So thank you for the question.
Do you have anything to add, John? Or should no? Okay. Um, so the next question um, is how much solidarity exists among Christians in Palestine, i.e., Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant?
I think in Palestine it's quite unique because of all the different churches that exist here, and it's such a small community. In terms of the heads of churches, there tends to be quite good relations. They meet frequently and oftenly, and they usually also write statements, so you can read some of the statements that they write together. And again, because they're such a small community, they tend to coordinate some of their efforts together, especially when it comes to dealing with issues of taxation, land, rights, and so on and so forth. I'd say that amongst the laity, there's even more of good relations because, again, the community is so small that many families tend to be very mixed. So people coming from Catholic, Orthodox, at times also Armenian, Syriac, Protestant, evangelical families, so all mixed with each other due to marriage and being such a small community. So generally speaking, I think there's good relations between the Christians. Not perfect, but because of the context, I think we're pretty tight.
So another question, given the situation that you described in our talk with oppression and persecution, one of our participants wants to know how you can cultivate a spiritual practice that provides some context for hope in the midst of war, in the midst of persecution, in the midst of oppression. How do you, both John and Sam, find a spiritual discipline to see through much of well, we'll use the metaphor darkness.
I will ask John also to complement my answer here, so it only won't be only one brother answering this question because I think it deserves two, and maybe even more. But the first spiritual uh, exercise, and I really think is the spirit of the book, is through lament, and here is where we draw on Job, the book of Job, where we try and first not be like the friends of Job, who only increase the suffering of the victim by providing rational explanations or by blaming the victim, but first it's lamenting and really drawing on that call for God to be accountable. Why are we suffering? Why is this great evil happening? Why do you seem absent? And I think actually through the practice of lamentation, you already affirming that the world isn't the way it should be. And by affirming that the world isn't as the way it should be, you already begin the imagination of how the world should be like. And really, uh, beyond just the imagination of where the world should be, there's also a great element of relationship here in lament. You know, Job has a great line that says, at the end of his suffering and at the end of the back and forth with God, um, he says, I have heard of your name, speaking to God, but now I have seen your face. And I think in this place of great suffering and just trying to look for hope, we want to lament and be able to see God's face and not only hear about God. So in essence, that's what we're trying to frame our hope in, and that was where the book was written out of. That's that place of lament. Um, yeah, John, maybe you can speak about uh, Holy Saturday as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that an indigenous practice here amongst the Palestinian Christians is the Holy Fire ceremony that happens on Holy Saturday of Easter, according to the Eastern calendar. And it's probably the most powerful and important day for Christians. And it's really interesting that it happens on Saturday and it doesn't happen on Sunday. And I think this holds brilliantly the tension between Friday and Sunday, crucifixion and resurrection, and not wanting to quickly move from Friday to Sunday very, very quickly to this point of resurrection, but actually to sit with the pain, the suffering, the darkness, and in many ways the trauma. And I think Holy Saturday is a really important day for at least Christians to contemplate and to take very, very seriously in our spiritual lives. The second thing I'd say is on Sunday, according to the lectionary, the passage was the Samaritan woman, Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman. And I think also us crossing boundaries, social, political, class, gender boundaries, meeting people who are different than us, speaking to those on the margins is also a very key spiritual practice. And being that living water or living hope that Jesus speaks of in that passage.
Thank you. So we have one more question, and it's going to be related to the reconciliation and liberation. So one of our participants wants to know about your ability to love your neighbor, to love the one who persecutes you, and what that spiritual practice looks like when that persecution turns into oppression, turns into suffering, and turns into death. How does your theology inform this way of, very similar to your grandmother, the impulse to bake bread as opposed to fight back, or that this love is a form of fighting back? I don't. So I'm asking both of you because the liberation and reconciliation part seems to be connected to that question.
I'll just mention that the grandmother is actually another contributor's grandmother. It's Yusuf's grandmother in Gaza who speaks about that moment. But just to give you a real example, we live in a building, and one of the neighbors is an Israeli Jew who, since the beginning of the war, he has put the flag of the Third Temple up on a huge pole and right in front of our balcony in an active way to provocate us. And on one hand, it's very easy to get angry at that person and to be preoccupied with what he's trying to do. And he's also done other racist stuff towards, like barking at us and saying all sorts of curses with religious tones to them. The first thing is the compass that our parents gave us, and that is love of neighbor. If the way we behave, our theology, our politics does not love our neighbor, then there's something wrong with it. So one thing that we sometimes do is we pray, literally pray for people like that neighbor and others who are actively provoking and oppressing us. Because when you do pray, you're seeking the good for that person. And I think it really does create a difference. And at the same time, is not backing down to this type of oppression. So not to believe the dehumanization that these oppressive forces or individuals are also placing on us.
There's two ways that I want to answer the question. The first is that loving someone doesn't mean that you necessarily like them or you have feelings that are very nice towards that person, but loving them is really truly truly wishing for the good, for the goodness of them. Similar to the goodness when God said after the creation of the cosmos, it is good. So it's really loving in that sense, not necessarily in liking them. And trust me, that neighbor, I don't like him. And maybe sometimes I don't love him, but definitely we try to imitate that loveness, which is also confrontation at times, you know, because when your oppressor is sinning against you, he is also dehumanizing, they're also dehumanizing themselves. And part of loving them is to make sure that they are also untangled from this dehumanization process that all people experience, oppressed and oppressor. So part of liberating materially and spiritually myself and oppressed people is also an act of love for the oppressor. The oppressor really dehumanizes themselves when they are so violent and sinful against other people. And we are seeing this especially in these very dark times throughout the region. So that's the first part. And the second part is that uh, if you, in times where I uh, feel that love, if I'm starting to have hateful thoughts towards other people, it's when I start feeling that I'm dehumanizing myself. So actually, that act of love, an act of will to reconcile with those who persecute me keeps my own humanity intact, or I still affirm my own humanity in the way I was intended and when God created me. So there's one aspect which is I don't necessarily like the person, but I love them. And the second aspect is I also do this for my own humanity as Samuel, and I think broadly as a community.
Thank you both. I'm glad that you were able to make both. And John, I'm grateful that your travel restrictions brought you to us just for one more time. I want to reiterate that the book is in the chat, and you really should read it. And I don't think it needs to be repeated, but you two are incredible people, and I'm glad that we are in community, and I'm glad that folks that are connected to the ICJS got to meet you. I know that I'll be seeing you soon, but it's nice that all that you can share this with our community.